want to talk to you today about one of the basic questions of metaphysics. Metaphysics is, in general, the area of philosophy that examines what there is, what the structure of the world is, not only what it consists in, but what kinds of things it consists in, and what relations those kinds have to one another. Some of those questions are, of course, scientific questions, but metaphysics asks the most basic categorical questions about what there is and how those things are structured. Today I'm going to focus on a particular problem involving universals. What is a universal? It's something that can have multiple instances. A universal is something you can find in a variety of different places. It has lots of instances. It's exemplified, at least potentially, in a variety of places. A particular, in contrast, is something that there's only one of. There is just one instance. It cannot have multiple instances. So we can define it this way. A universal can be many in the sense that it can have multiple instances. But a particular can't. There's only one of it. I am, for example, a particular. There's only one of me. Even if you cloned me, you would have other particular copies very similar to me, but they would be individual particular human beings. I would not suddenly become a universal. Humanity, on the other hand, is a universal. You can find lots of instances of it, about 7 billion on the planet right now. And so humanity is something that is instantiated in many different places. Here are a couple of examples, very simple examples. First of all, here are three particular triangles, a black triangle, a green one, and a blue one. They're all triangles. The word triangle applies to every single one of them. Now you could say, well, by virtue of what does the word triangle apply to them all? They must have something in common. That thing that they have in common is triangularity. Triangularity is exemplified here in the black triangle, here in the green one, here in the blue one. So triangularity is the sort of thing that can have multiple instances. It's a universal. Each of these, on the other hand, are particular geometric figures. The same thing is going on over here. Here we have a blue triangle, a blue circle, a blue square. Each of those is a particular geometric figure, but on the other hand, they have something in common. We apply the word blue to each one of them because they're all blue. They share a color. And that color then is something that has multiple instances. We find blue here in the triangle, blue here in the circle, blue here in the square. And so blue is a universal. Well, if we think of things that way, we realize that often we form these abstract nouns like triangularity or kindness or friendship in a way that suggests we're looking at something that is instantiated in the world in a variety of different places. There are many particular people engaged in particular human relationships that we classify as friendships. We call those people friends, but by virtue of what? Well, those relationships have something in common, namely friendship. Friendship is the universal that is found instantiated in lots of different human relationships. Here's another example. Miles Davis is a particular person, or was a particular person. Miles was not only a great jazz musician, a great composer, someone who managed to transform jazz not once but several different times. He was a particular and a particularly unique and talented human being. But the song, So What, is a universal. It has multiple instances. You find it, for example, on this album. You find it as well here in the Real Book. You find it as also in this book of jazz classics. All of those are instances of So What. And of course, it's something you might hear in many different contexts. Every time you hear that, you can say, that's so what. So what is something that has multiple instances in audio forms, electronic forms, printed forms. All of those are instances of so what. But each of those is a particular instance. It's a particular performance of so what, a particular copy of the sheet music, a particular recording. Those things are particular instances of the general abstract universal, which is the music. So what? All this seems simple enough. What's the basic metaphysical question? It's about the reality of universals. Everyone more or less agrees that particulars exist. There are particular people, particular performances of music, particular events, occurrences, particular markers. But what about universals? Are they real? And if they are real, if they are in some sense constituents of the world, are they constituents of the world that are really out there? Are they mind independent? Or are they mind dependent? Are they in some way constructions of the human mind? Let's take a look at the possibilities here. We might say, and this is a view known as realism, or, for its most famous advocate, Platonism, we could say that universals are real. They are real constituents of the world, and moreover, they're independent of the mind. In fact, we can find friendship instantiated in many different relationships. Humanity expressed, instantiated, exemplified in many different human beings. And we share a concept of humanity because there is one humanity outside of each of our minds that we're referring to. So, the view here is that universals are real and moreover mind independent. Blue is something that is not just a construction of my mind, it really is a color in the world. It really is instantiated here and here and here. Blue is something that is mind independent. The same thing with triangularity. Triangularity is found here, here, and here, but it is not merely a construction of my mind, it's something that is actually present in those geometric shapes. The classic statement of this is in Plato's Republic. This is Socrates talking, and he's referring here to people doing geometry, geometers. He says, don't you know that they make use of visible forms and reason about them by, for example, drawing triangles on a board? They're thinking not of these, but of the ideals that they resemble, not of the figures they draw, but of the absolute square, absolute diameter, and so on. The forms they draw or make that have shadows and reflections in water of their own are converted by them into images. But they're really seeking to behold the things themselves, which can only be seen with the eye of the mind. So these forms, as he calls them, these universals, are things that really are out there, really are independent of the mind. They're not the particular images that we draw or make. They're not simply concepts that we have. They are real constituents of the world. A second attitude we might have is known as conceptualism. And the view here is that universals are real, they do exist, but on the other hand, they are constructions of the mind. They are mind dependent.
That universals exist but depend on the mind. Immanuel Kant said, but a concept is always, in form, something universal that serves as a rule.
So we could think, if we're a conceptualist, that yes, things like friendship, triangularity, blue, humanity, those are things that we can talk about. There are such entities, but they're constructions. In something like the way, well, a variety of other things might be human constructions. Concepts, for example, are things that we build. Hence it's called conceptualism. They think we start with the concept of, for example, humanity or triangularity or blue, and then we talk about an object as corresponding to that, but we don't think of the concept as primarily of that object, the object having an independent existence. Instead, we start with the concept, and then we project an object on the basis of our concept. The final attitude is nominalism. As the name suggests, this view, realism, holds that universals are real constituents of the world independently of the mind, truly out there. Conceptualism holds that, at root, they're concepts. They are part of the world, but they're dependent on the mind. The nominalist says they're essentially names. Really, we just have the word triangle, the word blue, and they apply to certain things. There are rules that govern their application. But there is no such thing as triangularity or blue in the world. There are simply linguistic items and then rules we have for operating with those linguistic items. So the nominalist says universals are not, and of course if they're not real, then we can say, yeah, the issue of whether they're dependent or independent of the mind doesn't even arise. Actually, if we were forced to choose as a nominalist, we would choose mind dependence, since really in the end, all that's going on here is that we've got these names, like the word triangle or the word blue that we apply to various things. Of course, not proper names, they can apply to many different things, but they're common nouns, common names that apply to a bunch of different things at once, or at least can apply to many different things at once. And those things, well, don't really refer to anything that is universal. They are simply words that we use. So one way of looking at this is to say, look, to the extent that there's anything like the color blue, or triangularity, or humanity, or friendship, they are simply things that are, you might say, the result of our uses of language. And that's certainly mind-dependent. But really, that's misleading. They aren't constituents of the world at all. So, if we think about the basic picture here, and imagine someone here beholding, let's say, a triangle, we can say, all right, here's a particular object. The person sees the particular object. They think about it. They classify it as a triangle. Maybe they say something and use the word triangle. And what's going on here exactly? Well, the nominalist simply says, hey, they recognize that this word applies to that object. End of story. If we want to talk then about the rules governing that word and the general pattern of usage of that word, it may be useful to actually introduce a term like triangularity, but it doesn't stand for anything. It's something like a fiction we introduce. Really, there's just the word and the object the word refers to. The conceptualist says, well, that's not quite right. There is a concept in that person's mind of triangularity. The word has the meaning it has because of that concept. It in some ways stands for that concept, and that concept is something that applies to that particular triangle. We recognize, aha, this concept applies, and so we're able in that way to use the word triangle. But there's nothing like triangularity except for that concept that's in the mind.
You might be thinking, all right, that sounds great, but I have a different mind than my parents. I have a different mind than my friends, maybe. And if that's the case, then does that mean I have different conceptualizations of universals? Does that mean that, let's say, justice, for example, is different for me than someone else? Practically, this seems to be a problem.
The realist says, that won't do. This isn't just a concept we make up, and then we decide that there are triangles as if we were making up the concept of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, as Shakespeare did, and then applying that to various things in the world. No, it's not like that at all. This isn't anything like a concept of a fictional object. It's certainly not a fiction. Instead, this is a concept of something that really exists outside the mind. That's how it's possible for many of us to talk about triangularity, or the color blue, or friendship, or humanity. And so the realist insists there must be something outside the mind, that concept is a concept of, that word triangle in some way, directly or indirectly, relates to. All of these three attitudes are found in the history of philosophy. Plato, of course, is a famous realist, but there are many others. People in the Nyaya Vaisheshika tradition in India are primarily realists about universals. Conceptualists are also found in the West, especially in modern philosophy, in India throughout its history. For example, Immanuel Kant describes a concept as something that serves as a rule and allows us to apply language to, and thought for that matter, to particulars. And then nominalists are also found. The classic nominalists, William of Ockham and a variety of others, formulated this view in medieval times. But John Locke is a famous, more modern example. Locke says all things that exist are only particulars. In other words, there are no universals, everything is particular.